It wouldn't be at all unfair to suggest that there has been some pretty disappointing horror movies so far this year. Hellboy crashed out uninspiringly despite promise, Brightburn did anything other than burn brightly, and Pet Sematary failed to raise much of a pulse. But it has not all been bad, and horror film fans have been treated across the spectrum to some great experiences. We've had conventional scares, nostalgic bumps in the night, and that special kind of psychological fear that haunts you on an entirely other level. But what has been the best of this year's crop so far? Let's stick on our flower crowns and find the hell out, shall we? I am the May Queen Ash from What Culture, and these are the 10 best horror movies of 2019 so far. 10. Piercing. You really have to admire any movie that sets out to introduce characters you'd never even like if you spent days in their company, let alone hours. It's the kind of ballsy move that isolates audiences and adds a specific challenge to getting your film over. But it's something that some of the best horror filmmakers manage repeatedly. It's also the bedrock of Piercing, which doesn't so much invite you to care about its leads, but rather revel in their weirdness. A perverse, pitch-black comedy horror starring Mia Wasikowska and Christopher Abbott, it's basically a meet-cute between a man obsessed with the idea of murdering someone and the escort he hires to be his victim, who ends up harboring her own dark secrets. As they always do. What follows is a creepy, unsettling tango of encouragement and conflict, beautifully and warmly shot as if to disquiet it even more. It's weird and surreal and nightmarish and not for everyone, but it is certainly interesting and compelling. 9. Child's Play. The reboot of Child's Play was never going to be all things to all fans, particularly as it seemed so brazenly keen on distinguishing itself from the original with a whole new creative team and, gasp, a different voice for Chucky. But we needn't have been all that worried. Yes, the reboot is very much a new beginning, but it in no way tramples on the legacy of the original, and the decision to bring in a new voice actor worked delightfully well because it was Mark Hamill and not some 2-bit inferior alternative. If you didn't like the original and its sick sense of humour, there is probably little for you here. But there is enough fun, enough gore, and enough of a clever commentary on modern consumerism and the digital age to grip. It's got a nastier edge than where the Chucky movies had gone pre-reset, which is not entirely a bad thing, with an overt attempt to be more hip and happening, and you have to admire the impressive commitment to trying something different rather than trotting out a beloved character and not giving much of a what else they do. And naturally, Hamill is wonderful. Because he always is. 8. Midsommar. Now, personally, I wasn't a bigger fan of this movie as I expected to be, but it is still a respectable horror experience that deserves its plaudits. Given the weight of expectation on director Ari Aster sparked by Hereditary's success, what he did next was always going to be heavily hyped. And, like Jordan Peele, Aster avoided the temptation to make something more commercially minded in the interest of building his own financial brand, and instead went even more weird. The result is ridiculously divisive, as I have mentioned, but the spellbinding oddity of focusing as much on the ghosts of family past trauma, which is already a running theme for him, as well as on the evil machinations of the Swedish cult the cast find themselves the guest of, is enrapturing. It's not so much scary as unsettling, with lots of big banter laugh moments. And Aster proves himself horribly adept at sticking his finger in wounds and just pushing. Ugh. Following her excellent career choices so far, Florence Pugh is great as Danny. And whilst there's some suspension of disbelief in her and her friends' willingness to stay with the cult even after they have seen some serious red flags, it is just nice to have some familiar horror tropes for a little strong footing at times. 7. I Trap the Devil. Slow burn is the new jump scare, but that's not to say there isn't still lots to love about the old ways, of course. This meditative horror is set at Christmas then, like all of the best horror movies. Hell, and all the best movies full stop. It clearly draws from Charles Beaumont's The Howling Man, with I Trap the Devil positing itself as a slow-burning, one-set story about a man who believes he has done what the title suggests. Naturally, it is very heavy on dread, even in the minutest and most mundane of things, with the first half's atmospherics working incredibly well. The latter half is a little less focused, but this is easily one of the most arresting and most promising horror debuts of the decade. Josh Lobo draws from the Twilight Zone tropes to inspire a sort of sidecar nostalgia for the show, but his real skill is in building a feeling, which creeps and crawls up to the bloody climax, and he has quickly announced himself as a horror filmmaker of some promise. 6. Hagazusa, A Heathen's Curse. Hagazusa, A Heathen's Curse is another horror debut, this time from writer-director Lucas Feigelfeld, which was initially released in 2017, but would have only been seen by wider audiences thanks to this year's release by Bloody Disgusting and Doppelganger. Even then, the term wider is probably a little overzealous. The film is essentially Germany's answer to The Witch, set in the 15th century but with way weirder inclinations, and it is definitely one for less conventional horror fans. If you're expecting Saw, then you're gonna leave Saw. It's something more linked to the personal experience of psychosis and unravels a very claustrophobic nightmare. It's beautifully shot and repugnant at the same time, and the best indication of whether you'll like it is how you react to the idea that it is basically Darren Aronofsky's mother on acid. Lots and lots of acid. 5. The Hole in the Ground. Stick a creepy, slightly Victorian-looking kid in a horror movie and you've got a recipe for a strong self-marketing head start. That said though, Lee Cronin's The Hole in the Ground didn't get anything like the attention it deserved when it was released back in March. Based on the age-old parental anxiety of losing your children, and not just in the tangible physical way but psychologically, because the trauma of replacement goes hand in hand with childhood identity issues, it is creepy and haunting without ever being balls-out scary. There's very much a Shining sort of vibe bundled in there too, and while it absolutely could have been more overtly scary, the restraint shown is admirable and arguably more successful in giving the horror legs after the credits. 4. The Perfection. Since making the wonderfully caustic Dom Hemingway, which is very much an underrated gem, Richard Shepard has worked in TV, with both Salem and The Twilight Zone under his belt. But he returned to features for The Perfection, which originally debuted at Fantastic Fest in 2018. Landing quietly on Netflix, which is often a worrying sign, this tale of musical talent and professional jealousy that makes way for something altogether more gruesome has shades of Black Swan about it. If Park Chan-wook had made it, perhaps. It's sadistic, fetishistic, and disturbing in its use of sexual violence in particular. But there's an admirable agenda to take the audience on a shocking, wholly unexpected ride, and it will genuinely keep you guessing until its final rug pull and deeply disturbing final image. It's not one to watch with the family, but then the fun ones rarely are. 3. Crawl. For some people, if you hear a creature feature horror, you run to the hills. For a whole world of fans, though, the idea of things slithering, scuttling, and yes, crawling after potential victims is enough to get your blood immediately up. That's why all of those amazing Sharknado films exist, after all. Crawl is far from that bargain basement nonsense, even if its premise is a little ludicrous. Basically, a hurricane traps a woman in the crawl space of her father's house. He's played by Barry Pepper, so the top end of the cast is pretty solid. There's also a dog, if that floats your boat, and the character is a champion swimmer, obviously. If it had Jason Statham in, it would have made a fortune. Anyway, the plot is barely even important, because what you want from a movie like Crawl is an insight into the unimaginable horror of being trapped in your own flooding house with a horde of alligators. And it delivers on that feeling in some style. 2. One Cut of the Dead. Zombie movies are so well done now that super self-aware, meta-zombie flicks seeking to reinvent the genre are themselves a tired subgenre these days. So when something with Of the Dead in the title rocks up, horror fans can be forgiven for raising an eyebrow or two and just assuming it's another soulless cash-in on George Romero's good name. But One Cut of the Dead is different. Originally released in November 2017, Shinichiro Ueda's micro-budget homage to homemade horror can legitimately claim to have breathed real life into the zombie genre, and when it finally became possible to see it widely in 2019, it was almost like a return to the days of VHS bootleg horrors being passed around. It also comes with a loving homage to the craft of cheap horror, which is its own little joy. Inevitably marketed on the epic 37-minute opening single shot that gives the film its name, this low-budget zombie movie within a low-budget zombie movie is a real delight, and it hides the fact that it cost only $25,000 so well that it's not really as much of a consideration as you'd think when you hear that number. 1. Us. When the first trailers for Jordan Peele's Us were revealed, it appeared that he was making a straight home invasion, body snatcher chiller that would play on the fundamental anxiety that there is no more horrific a transformation we can witness than our own. It's the same fear that inspired the creation of Mr. Hyde and every werewolf story, and it was fertile enough ground for Peele to explore. Naturally, the Get Out director had way more creative ideas than anything you could ever call simple, and has similar political wounds to explore as Get Out, though Peele is keen for his audience to come to the conversation themselves. Whether it's as successful as Get Out remains to be seen, but it is a hugely impressive sophomore effort, and is both frightening and intriguing enough to elicit multiple watches. And that's our list. What have been your favourite horror movies of 2019? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. I've been Ash, and this has been What Culture. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and double check your children for changelings at regular intervals. Thanks for watching.